here we go.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name's Jill Kilborn, and I'm a BHA member, and I'm here tonight with Jill M on her screen, but Jill G and Andrea Shortsleeve for a talk that we've put together with Andrea. So this group kind of originated as a space for women to get together and have a conversation with kind of less pressure and a more open atmosphere. And we felt that we wanted to keep it open to more people and just make sure that that environment was provided for everybody. So definitely know that this space is kind of encourages questions of all sorts from all different backgrounds and levels of experience in the field. And that's really what we wanted to provide through the talks that we're going to be doing through the forum with BHA. So I'm gonna just go over a few ground rules that we have through the talk, just to kind of get everybody in the housekeeping mode when it comes to Zoom. I think we're all kind of used to this kind of forum at this point, but just want to know that if you want to keep your camera off, feel free to keep it off, whatever your comfort level is. Don't mind seeing faces. It's always nice to see faces. If you have a comment, feel free to put it in the chat. Jill G and Jill K, I will kind of monitor that chat and we'll help Andrea with questions at the end of the talk. She has a few breaks kind of mixed into the talk so that we can maybe open it up for some conversation during the talk, and we'll do like a question and answer session at the end. And also just if you could keep your microphones off during the talk itself, just to minimize any kind of background noise and anything that's going on there. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jill G or M to talk a little bit about
to the maiden. G is attached to the maiden name and M is attached to the married name. So you can remember that, M married. But I answer to both, so it's all good. So tonight's presentation is we're going to be talking about what a land ethic is and how it relates to land access and what this can mean for landowners and hunters in Vermont and all across New England. And how can we as hunters maintain that tradition of open access? And Andrea Shortsleeve is a private lands habitat biologist, and she's a native Vermonter who received a BS in wildlife from McGill University and a master's in human dimensions and natural resources from Colorado State University. She works on private lands habitat management, assisting landowners in habitat improvement through the federal EQIP program as part of the Farm Bill. She works with county foresters in Vermont's Forest, Parks, and Recreation Department to include wildlife habitat considerations in the development of forest management plans, and works directly on habitat conservation outreach efforts. In her free time, Andrea enjoys hiking, cross-country skiing with her dog, hunting, fishing, gardening, and enjoying the water through rafting, paddleboarding, and swimming. So thank you, Andrea, for taking the time, and I will turn it over to you.
Great, well, thanks. Let me start sharing my screen and make sure that can you guys see my screen okay?
It is coming up as we speak. There we go. Yep, we've got it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to this group. I think it's a really important group to have. And so I'm going to be talking about a land ethic and land access. And just right out of the gate, I want to make sure that I say that, you know, a land ethic is sometimes kind of hard to talk about. This was a little bit difficult for me to really figure out what to put on slides, because sometimes it's not very tangible and it's a really theoretical thing. So, and I also don't have any silver bullet answers on how to solve land access issues. So we'll start with that. So I work for the Department of Fish and Wildlife here in Vermont, and our mission is the conservation of all fish, wildlife, plants, habitats for the people of Vermont. And a lot of people are really surprised to learn that our mission includes the conservation of all wild living things here in the state. Do that from bumblebees to bobcats, muskies, maples, and as well as all the natural communities that you can find those species in. And we serve all Vermonters, from hunters and anglers to those that just like to look at wildlife from a distance. And we work closely with towns and conservation districts and providing technical assistance and direct help to landowners looking to improve their property. And we take our commitment to future generations very seriously as we work to ensure that there's healthy and thriving wildlife and wild places for our children and grandchildren to enjoy. I'm also part of a group called Land Ethic Vermont, which is a group of organizations across the state that has began working to develop a thinking community of Vermont environmental professionals. And we do this to increase the awareness of and just kind of popularize the conversation about a land ethic in Vermont. And our steering committee is made up of all of the organizations that have the logos there. And we also work with a lot of partners, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers being one of them. Matt Brenton has been a great partner to work with in our events and our trainings. And Ethan's also been involved in our trainings at the Craftsbury Outdoor Center. So it's been a really interesting partnership that we're working to create a movement basically to develop, maintain, inspire, and promote a land ethic amongst the people of Vermont. And if anyone's interested in that or has any questions, please feel free to ask me during the talk. So today I'm going to go over kind of just the basics of what a land ethic is, talk about land access in Vermont and in kind of New England as a whole, and then talk about how do we bridge the gap between getting on private property and people who are posting, and how do we just maintain that open land. So what is a land ethic? It's a phrase that I'm sure most of you have heard of, whether it's, you've realized it or not, whether it's been in an informal setting or more of kind of a relaxed conversation. And it's something that we all have, whether we can verbalize it or not. And it's something that I've always had, but when I was first kind of told the phrase a land ethic, I had a very hard time kind of putting it into words and talking about what it is. But at the base of it, it was a phrase that was first published by ALDO Leopold in 1949. It was the final essay in his book, A Sand County Almanac. And it's really considered to be one of his most enduring ideas. And it's a call for a moral responsibility of humans to the natural world. And it was written, back in 1949 or published in 1949, but it's still a really extremely relevant idea in today's society. So it's important that we talk about. So just quickly, ALDO Leopold is considered to be the father, or probably now the grandfather, of conservation here in the US. He was an author, an ecologist, a forester, a hunter. He spent a lot of time out in New Mexico in the West as a ranger and forester for the Forest Service, as it was a new agency, and then spent a lot of time up in the Wisconsin area, where he had a cabin with his family, and he did a lot of his writing. And it's kind of where a lot of his big ideas are coming from. So a land ethic, going back to this, ethics are, kind of grounded in values, and they're the moral sense of what's right and wrong. And ethics are demonstrated by the way people live their lives. When a person cares about something or someone, their actions convey that care and respect and invite the same in return. And during Leopold's time, when he was alive, an ethic was defined as a system of standards, morals, and rules, and how humans treat each other. Leopold wondered why, when we have ethical standards with respect to other people, why our relationship with the land was unethical, resulting in widespread environmental degradation of the time. And just as a lack of ethics harms our human communities, Leopold noted that a lack of ethics towards the land harmed our natural communities and ultimately ourselves, as we rely on the land for our survival and our quality of life. And his philosophy really changed the role of humans from the conqueror of the land community to more of a member and a citizen of that community. And really, when we see the land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. In Leopold's vision of a land ethic, relationships between people and the land are intertwined, and care for people cannot be separated from care for the land. And it's a moral code of conduct that grows out of these interconnected relationships. And so at its core, the idea of a land ethic is simply about caring about people, about the land, and about strengthening the relationships between the two of them. And of course, you know, Leopold doesn't come without his own criticism from newer conservationists. You know, and of course, there are other writers that we can now read and take their take on land ethics. And so I just threw up a couple of some of my favorite books that I've read and has really kind of stirred thoughts of land ethics in my mind. And so I was going to take a break to see if anyone had any other writers or other writings that have spoken to you about a land ethic. So I don't know if anyone wants to pop in the chat or just jump in, you're more than welcome to. Okay, well, hearing none, we will move on. So applying a land ethic is kind of a tricky thing. You know, I think when we talk about a land ethic, people are looking for a list of rules or a set of commandments and what's right and wrong. And Leopold really doesn't outline that. The closest thing he gets to articulating a set of rules or standards that help us judge whether actions are right or wrong is represented in one of his more famous quotes. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. And even this is open to interpretation. As we learn more about our natural world and biotic communities, integrity and stability definitely have things that we can interpret in our own ways. And so that's really kind of why it's been so difficult to develop this presentation. There's really no right way or a singular answer to some of these issues that we're dealing with in our natural world, in our conservation efforts. But it's extremely applicable when we're talking about hunting and we're talking about land access. Leopold was really clear in knowing that people's environmental values grow directly from their experiences. And direct contact with the natural world is a key factor in shaping our ability to extend our ethics beyond our own self-interest and into the world around us. He also recognized that the relationship between people and each other and people in the land was a very complex one, and it's an evolutionary process. And I think we see that all the time when we're working in natural resources. And so one more pretty famous quote that kind of, I think, sums up how we can apply a land ethic is that nothing so important as an ethic was ever written. Instead, it involves in the minds of a thinking community, which is really what kind of brings us here today. And as our group with backcountry hunters and anglers and the open space group, it's really creating kind of a thinking community that can help shape our land ethic, both individually and communally, as you know, into the 21st century and beyond. So I really encourage you to take time to think about your own ethic and your own motivations, your experiences out in the natural world, and why you do the things that you do, and how we can have a thoughtful dialogue with different perspectives with people's relationships in the land. So if anyone has any questions real quick, we can stop here before we move on. So land access in New England, it's commonly surveyed as one of the biggest challenges in hunting in this part of the world, finding a place to hunt that's consistent. And it's also one of the reasons why hunters are dropping out of hunting, to be frank. I know people that have hunted for decades, and now they just are frustrated without having a place to hunt. And it's one of the reasons why they don't go out as often as they would like. But here in New England, we have kind of a different setup than in the rest of the country. We have a tradition of open land. And I use that word tradition kind of lightly. I think sometimes that's very difficult. It's kind of a loaded term, I think, when we talk about hunting and moving forward in the future of our activity. But open land in New England has been around since, I found, since the year 1641, when Massachusetts wrote the Great Ponds Law into law. Basically acknowledged that hunters and anglers could use the land that was there for the common good. Maine has an implied access law. Their situation is very different, with a lot of wide open public lands in the state, and people have implied access, basically, is how it's written into the law. New Hampshire, and Jill, you can correct me on this one. It's more of a permission-based use, but landowners are encouraged to keep their land open. They get additional tax savings when enrolled in the current use program. And in Vermont here, we have the right to hunt written into the Constitution of our state. And it is also an open land state where, unless it's posted, you can go without trespassing. And here's just the article from our Constitution here in Vermont, just saying that we have the liberty to hunt and fowl on lands that are here in the state. And this was written by the framers of the Constitution with the idea that they just came from Europe, where things were not the same situation, and they wanted to make sure that this was guaranteed to all Vermonters for I guess the foreseeable future, as the Constitution stood. Now, New England and the East Coast is a little different than the rest of the country, being mostly privately owned. This map of Vermont, all of the tan color, that beige color, represents all of the privately owned land, excuse me, and that totals up to about 85% of the state. Over 80% of our forests are privately owned. In New Hampshire, right across the river, 70% of the state is privately owned, and Maine is a whopping 90% of the state. And that's definitely different if you move out west, and it changes a little bit as you move into the Midwest as well. And so as a hunter, with all that private land, things were great with a kind of an open land tradition, being able to go and hunt kind of where you want to go. However, things are changing in the landscape, and there's a real big question now for hunters of how do we bridge that gap? How do we maintain our open land access with the changing times? In Vermont, we have organized groups that are offering to help each other post their land. There's petitions to the legislature. It's an annual article in the newspaper, at least, about what a burden the open land access is to landowners. And it's a really difficult conversation to have and to hear as a hunter and as someone who really appreciates the open land access that we have here. And so I work with landowners, working on habitat, and when I go to their properties, I often talk to them about whether they have posted land, how they feel about that, and what they're thinking. And I'm getting a lot of different answers of why people are either changing their minds and posting land, or why they're considering it. A lot of it has to do with the transfer of land from one generation to another across the country. We're in the largest intergenerational land transfer that we've seen ever. A lot of land is being sold and being given down to younger generations who have a different kind of land ethic and a different perspective on land. We have a lot of new landowners moving into the state. This past year has shown that as people have been fleeing the cities during the pandemic. We have a lot of out-of-state landowners that have second houses here that also don't feel comfortable necessarily having open land while they're gone from the area. People with lack of experience with hunters also feel less comfortable having an open land policy. And then of course, unfortunately, not all hunters are like us. Sometimes they leave litter, sometimes they drive when they're not supposed to, and that drives people to post their land when they previously haven't. If anyone in the group has other reasons that they've heard why land is being posted, feel free to put it in the chat or chime in.
I do have one question, Andrea.
Yeah.
So has anybody like done a study or a poll trying to figure out like what % of each of these categories is driving that posting?
You know, we haven't done that, and it's more just anecdotal. And I'm trying to think the last kind of survey we've done in the last, I don't know, 10 years or so. We didn't split it out onto why people are posting their land.
Right, thank you. I just thought it might be interesting to know the top, the top 3 reasons why, or so. Thank you.
Yeah, and the more that I talk to landowners, it's not necessarily that they're against hunting. It's they've either have had bad experiences, people leaving a lot of litter, or they're just scared about safety being on their property during hunting seasons, and knowing who's out there, knowing that their dog's not going to get shot, things like that. That just kind of, as hunters, aren't necessarily something that we would think of being a real issue, I guess. And then of course there's also the people that want to hunt on their property and keep it closed because that's where they hunt. So I guess there's 2 sides to that. So I just wanted to go through a couple things of, if you do know landowners and your neighbors or people in your community that have started to post, just things that you can talk about to kind of encourage them, to remind them of the reasons why having an open land is important, and allowing a lot of people to hunt, or allowing people to hunt on your property is beneficial. And this is mostly focused on deer hunting. I know that there's other types of hunting that also need access, but deer hunting seems to be kind of synonymous with hunting in Vermont, and so we're gonna just focus on that for now. Talking about the ecological impacts is one of the biggest things that I talk to landowners about. We have a lot of heavy deer browse, kind of overpopulated deer in a lot of areas, and that leads to several other ecological impacts that, if people aren't really hunters, a lot of them are really into the wildflowers that they have on their property, the birds that they see, regenerating trees and vegetation, all things that are heavily impacted by heavy deer browse. And making that connection for landowners sometimes is really what pushes people over to allowing hunters on their property sometimes, once they start learning how it's all connected. Talking about different types of signing and alternatives to posting. Posting your land isn't the only way that you can make sure that you're safe, or the only way that you know who's on your property. In Vermont, we have safety zone signs that we have available for free that people can put up around their houses. Permission, hunting and fishing and trapping by permission only are also signs that I think promote a little bit of a different attitude on the landscape, rather than posted no trespassing signs. This shows that landowners are agreeable to hunting. They may just want to know who's out there, and they have certain requirements that they would like to talk to the hunter about. We've also been seeing signs, the last one on the right, the trail ethic, as other types of recreation have become a lot more popular, especially the Kingdom Trails area, other mountain biking communities have a lot of trails going through public lands or private lands for the public use. And we've been seeing more signs of this, of asking the public to use, be a good steward on people's properties. I think if you can familiarize yourself with the liability laws that are in your state, is something to let landowners know about. In Vermont, it's the liability law is strongly in the favor of the landowner. It really has, unless you're intentionally trying to injure someone, the liability of the landowner is very low. And I think sometimes that can act as a good obstacle for people for allowing open land. we hear a lot about, in our meetings and talking to landowners one-on-one, they're worried about safety and sometimes just not being familiar with firearms themselves or hunters themselves. They kind of have a misconception about how dangerous hunting is. And being able to talk about the statistics in your state is a really, really strong case. Getting a landowner or a friend involved in a hunter safety course that are free. They're all online now too. It just helps get them more familiar with the activity and with really just being familiar with firearms and hunters and being around people that are safe with that. And so if you do go up to, if you're in a position where you need to ask for access for a landowner that you don't know, there's some things that you can do to kind of improve perhaps your luck or your, I don't know, your just, the likelihood of being allowed access. And the first thing that I would say is do your homework. Start thinking about where you want to ask for permission way before the season starts. Like, don't do it, a week before deer season starts when a lot of people are probably asking the landowner. It helps if you bring a map to show that where their property boundaries are, and you can explain where you'd like to hunt and just make sure that you're on the same page. It just shows that you've done your research and you're taking this seriously. Be respectful when you arrive. Sometimes with new landowners, people that I've talked to are a little kind of overwhelmed and feel that people who have asked for access just assume that they're going to be getting it because the last landowner allowed them to. And I think just being respectful and not assuming that you'll be allowed on is a really, really key thing that we don't necessarily think about. Try to show up in clean clothes that aren't camouflage, show that you're a responsible person, and just being aware of a landowner's potential inexperience with hunting and firearms and being patient with that. Sometimes it helps to provide references. Bringing a business card really helps to give context to the landowner. If you're a stranger showing up kind of unannounced, it gives you more context in the real world of just someone other than just someone who wants permission to get on their property. Sometimes I've also seen people provide a list of other landowners that they've hunted with, and just to kind of, do that like a resume almost of references, and all of those things help. And just as a reminder, if you do get onto property and you're allowed the permission, just a reminder to be a good steward of the land. This is where your land ethics can really, really show through. Respect the request of what a landowner has for you, how silly they are. Whether they want you to pick up your shells after you're done, or they want to know where you're going to park and drive, where to walk, be aware of crops that are in the field. The same goes for putting up tree stands. I think in Vermont, actually, you need to have written permission from a landowner to install a tree stand. That doesn't always happen. And I think a lot of landowners are surprised by that and a little put off by that. Same goes for cameras. I've talked to a couple of landowners who were surprised to be out in the woods and find game cameras put out by hunters that they've given access to. So just making sure that you're on the same page with a landowner goes a long way. Should be common sense to leave gates as you found them. If they're open, leave them open. If they're closed, leave them closed. It always helps to pick up other people's litter. Don't be a litter bug yourself. And then finally, I think it goes a long way to report back to the landowner observations, what you've seen, different animal sightings that you've seen. I think it becomes, it shows that you're interested in the person's land. It doesn't hurt to share some of your harvest and send a thank you card and tell them how much you appreciate having that land access. And so finally, I just want to end with a quote that I thought kind of summed up a land ethic and land access and all of these changes that we're seeing by ALDO. It says, barring love and war, few enterprises are undertaken with such abandon or by such diverse individuals or with so paradoxical a mixture of appetite and altruism as that group of avocations known as outdoor recreation. It is by common consent a good thing for people to give back to nature, but wherein lies the goodness and what can be done to encourage its pursuit? On these questions, there is confusion of counsel, and only the most uncritical minds are free from doubt. And I think that sums up kind of where we are. So with that, again, thanks for having me, and I'll be happy to answer any questions and have a conversation.
That was great. Thank you, Andrea. I have a quick question, or maybe not so quick, but when I think about open access and the tradition of open access, and I think sometimes the piece that we forget to talk about is it's very much connected to hunting and our hunting public. But as a tradition for just the general public in the Northeast, I also think that that's a very important conversation to have. And sometimes I feel like if there was a way to communicate that to landowners as they come into these states with open access, and kind of have a conversation with them and talk about how it's more than just having hunting access. It's like a tradition that is grounded in the people that have grown up in New England and like appreciate the ability to roam, whether it be hunting or hiking or just out enjoying the woods. So being able to start that conversation, I think is a really important piece of it as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And we only seem to have some of these conversations, unfortunately, when there's a conflict or a real need. You know, like when someone has been found foraging fiddleheads on a landowner's property and they don't recognize that. Or I think it's a conversation we need to have more often before it becomes contentious. I agree. And it really is. It's something that I think unless you are from here and spend a lot of time here, you don't necessarily understand right off the bat.
Just one quick perspective that I just wanted to add, and that is that I'm not from there. I'm not from Vermont, but you know, I like one of the ways I describe it is that my place in Vermont is the only piece of dirt on the planet that is mine. However, I'm not from there, and I'm well aware of that. And so I think that in some of my relationships with other landowners, neighbors, I think it goes a long way when people know that you are invested in the community, that I'm just not here for the purpose of like recreation, that I care about the community, I care about my neighbors. And you know, at least one of the things I've learned being in the Northeast Kingdom for a few years is that so many people know each other, and the community is very small. So, and I mean, I didn't go into my relationships with other people thinking that way, but it's just sort of unfolded. And just when people realize that you care about your community, that you care about you know, the place, I think that can go a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been working with a landowner down in southern Vermont who it's been a family property for generations, but he has just moved from Colorado back to the property, and it's gorgeous. It's 400 acres and just lovely. And he's like, why would I post this? This doesn't belong to me. It's for everyone. And it was just such a nice thought. And he has since I think put up signs in town or on Front Porch Forum inviting people just to walk around, and I think there has been some reception to that, and it's pretty interesting. I don't hear a lot about that often, and it was nice.
Yeah, I've come around just from hearing from different people that we don't own the land necessarily, but we're just borrowing it for a while. And I think we could take a negative view of that and think about the taxes we pay and that sort of thing. But I also think we could think more holistically and about the ways that we just get to take care of it until the next person comes along. So I like to think that we're just borrowing it for the good reasons.
Right. It's not ours, it's just our turn. That's
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Yeah. Something you said, Andrea, made me just think about the idea of relationships. And Chris said it partially there, but not just relationships with other people, but relationships with the land and how we establish that. And I know I've hunted other places and other people's properties for a long time and love a spot and a reason. And I think sharing those ideas in those off moments, if you happen to run into a landowner or someone else who enjoys the same land, if you can share that, like, it's okay to love a spot that isn't yours and it may change. And I think sharing that conveys that relationship to the land and to the people that are around that place. And the idea of loving a place is a powerful thing that we don't often talk about, but people would probably gain something by sharing the idea of loving a place.
No, I think that's a really good point. And it shows that you're not just there, you're there for multiple reasons, I guess. And appreciating just being out there is one of them.
And on that thread, I found that older landowners that aren't able to get out on their land as much anymore, like they love it when you come back and tell them stories. Like they get really excited, you know, if you're able to feel that joy that they felt on their land before.
Well, I guess for a question for, I know Jill, you're kind of new to Vermont, at least recently, and Chris, like, have you had trouble, or what has your experience been getting access on to find places to hunt?
So for me, because I grew up in New Hampshire, so we could romp anywhere we wanted to go. But then, you know, when I was young, that it was happening where, you know, people were moving from out of state. That's been an issue for a long time, and posting land. But and there was liability. I remember being one of the biggest things in my area. But then moving out west, I was out there for 20 years. So when I came back, like, I'm scared to death of going on anybody's land without asking permission. That's just not how it rolls out west at all. So I'm always asking, and my neighbors are like, you don't have to ask me, just go. But I'm probably overcautious and like over the line, you know, in that regards.
No, I remember that same feeling. Yeah, when I came back from Montana. Yeah.
I don't know, Chris, if you wanted to add something. You're on mute.
Yeah, it's like I kind of shared earlier that I definitely am very aware that I'm not from Vermont. I'm not from the Northeast Kingdom. So I do try to keep that in mind. But the few instances that where I've asked, yeah, it's been a fine conversation, and it wasn't really necessarily uncomfortable. And oftentimes, like I mentioned earlier, it's because it came through an introduction. Oh, you should talk to, I know Charlie, you know, he's plowed my driveway, and I know you should talk to him. Or, you know, I'm going to go away. I'm going to go see my nephew in Boston. Can you tell me about the city? Can you can you feed my animals? So, you know, like those types of, you know, little favors, which I'm more than happy to do. Or a young couple who has a big property behind me was striking out in terms of getting an easement to run power to their place. They're building a place, and so being willing to kind of help them out there and getting them access to electricity, it's the least, you know, small favor that I can do for someone. So yeah, that kind of stuff, I think.
Building relationships.
So Andrea, I really like that sign, that trail ethic sign.
Mhm.
Has anyone ever made one for like hunting, like a hunting ethic sign people could post on their land?
I've seen like handmade ones that people have put up that say something like, I mean, it was a little old lady basically that wrote it, and it was a very long kind of paragraph of like, welcome to my land, like, you know, I'm happy that you can enjoy it, you know, please. And she like kind of listed some requests, and she must have photocopied it and put it like, you know, just kind of like posting signs so everyone could see it. And it was very interesting. And I thought it was a cute idea. I think it was a good idea if you can make it a little less like handwritten. But I think that would go a long ways to have that option.
Yeah, I wonder if it would make some landowners feel a lot better too about maybe not posting their land, but having more control over the type of behavior that was happening on their land, or you know, or kind of subdue some of those fears.
Mm-hmm. And that is one thing, like talking to landowners, you know, just because you allow access doesn't mean you're giving up your own rights and your own ability to kick people off or limit activities one way or the other. If you don't want someone to be doing something, then you can say that, regardless of whether your land's posted or not or anything. And I think that's something that isn't always explicitly said to landowners. And you can allow certain activities, you can prohibit others, and doesn't mean you have to close your whole land off.
I think that's a great point. I hadn't really thought about that, and I do know a bunch of landowners that have taken that approach for certain things. And with the landowners that I've interacted with, I find that the safety zone signs are huge for a lot of them. If they know that they can put those up and kind of feel like that they have a safe space around their home or their dwelling, but then leave the rest of their property open, I find that they're pretty effective in communicating and making people feel better about it. So yeah, signs are huge, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I think you don't have to necessarily post your whole land either. If a landowner wants to keep one area that's not for public access, they can post that section and leave the rest of it open. So it's not all black and white, I guess.
Andrea, you mentioned Kingdom Trails, and like a lot of kind of what happened the last year or two over there just kind of made me think how tenuous some of these relationships are, like how tenuous the willingness of a landowner to be open, how one bad interaction can kind of ruin it for everyone. Are you seeing more of that? Is that or is that just kind of like a scenario where it was just too much too often kind of thing?
You know, I think what I'm hearing and talking to landowners is that a lot of landowners are closing their property to hunting because of one-off, whether it's they found too much litter or they're ruining the roads or things like that. And I think one, it's a little different between bikers and hunters, or at least in the trails, because if that key landowner in the trail system shuts down their trails, then that whole network is altered. Whereas in the hunting community, if one landowner shuts off their property to hunting, that doesn't impact everyone in the same way. And so I think it gets pushed under the radar a little easier than in the network. And I think, you know, maybe this is just my feeling, but I think hunters are used to it now. Mountain bikers probably are not experiencing it, haven't experienced it as much, just because it's a newer thing. And so I think that's why it's probably created a lot more waves than I think some of the other interactions. I think we've also spent a lot of time, I mean, we spend a lot of time in hunting and hunter education, talking about a land ethic and being a good steward and being on people's property. And I don't know if that's always translated to other recreation groups. I'm not necessarily part of like other groups that in that way. And I just don't know what kind of conversations they're having in that respect.
So staying on this, oh, Matt, were you going to say something?
No, go ahead, Jim.
I was just going to say on this thread, I just thought it was interesting, Andrea, because in the presentation earlier, when it was talking about how the community ethic evolves, you know, and a land ethic evolves with the community. And now we're seeing such a huge influx of like recreation and, you know, biking and hiking and just doing everything and anything out in the woods and the wilderness. And so just thinking about that evolution of the land ethic in that context, I'm just putting out to you or the group, like what everyone thinks like the future, you know, the future holds in that way.
Well, I think we're kind of living in kind of a neat time, seeing how different groups are making different decisions and what the result is going to be. Like working with several different town forests here in Chittenden County, you know, there is a lot of kind of diverse user groups trying to use the same piece of property differently. And, you know, biking technology has changed. So, you know, normally you could, or historically you could say, well, the bikes aren't going to be out during hunting season, but now people, you know, bike all year round, and you have lights and you're going to be out later during the day, and it, you know, the two uses kind of interact a lot more. And so I don't know if we've really figured out how to handle it for everyone. I don't know if anyone else has an experience with it, but. Also, I think talking about other benefits of allowing hunting, like the forest health benefit when it comes to deer, has been a really big driver for a lot of kind of recreation, you know, public land management at least, and also kind of what landowners are, one reason that they're opening their lands to hunting a lot more.
I hadn't really thought about it in this context before, but your comments, both you, Andrea, and Jill, made me realize that, you know, hunting is dispersed recreation, and the impact that it has on a property in that way is very different from concentrated recreation that we seem like we're tending towards. So a conversation with landowners to understand, you know, the balance of those two things and how they interact and how it affects their property, I think important pieces of that conversation for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think as we have more varied and more year-round recreation groups, you know, fat bikes and you know, skiers have always been there, but just even, you know, trail runners on teeny tiny snowshoes, that sort of thing, that are there year-round. I think we start to approach a tragedy of the commons situation where everyone's using what's available, and I think it tends to make people want to hold on to what they see as theirs a little tighter and control that access. And I certainly understand that feeling. And it's an interesting sort of rural versus urban tolerance to other people being around that I think we're going to see that evolve over the coming decades. I don't think we've reached a level of homeostasis where everyone's learned to get along and handle these relationships and kind of ebb and flow around one another. I see us getting there eventually, but it's a tough transition as more folks want to recreate on the land, which is a pretty good problem to have. You know, when most people, well, you know, this is a screen-based activity, but when most people are involved in a screen-based activity, gosh, it's nice to have people who want to be outside breathing fresh air and seeing leaves fall. So while it's, you know, some version of a tragedy of the commons, I think it's also sort of a good problem.
Mm-hmm. I think this past year has really shown us too how important it is to have access to outdoors and open space for everyone.
So I think we're approaching 9 o'clock. We got 5 more minutes, so probably should think about starting to wrap things up. So Chris just asked, what begins as undifferentiated space becomes, whoops, I lost it.
I'm not asking, it just made me think of a quote. I'm trained as a geographer, so I always try to throw in geography quotes whenever possible. And I was just thinking about Matt and Andrea both said some things that made me think of this little quote, just what begins as undifferentiated space becomes place as we get to know it better and endow it with value. So more users out there in that landscape, you know, the value of these places, public, private, definitely becomes more valuable, which I guess, like Matt said, is kind of a good thing, I guess.
I think there are pluses and minuses to everything, and I think more people that value a space as a place, to use that terminology, I think it ultimately ends up being valuable. But I think there's a challenge that we all have to, a challenging time that we have to go through to share that space. Hunters have had the dispersed recreation market kind of cornered for a while, and it's hard to learn to share that. And you know, I still want big places where I can wander around and track a deer for miles and not worry about running across a fat biker or a hiker or a snowshoer. But if they're out there, gosh, at least they're out there enjoying it, and maybe they care enough to protect that space and keep it as wild and sort of untouched. You know, that's why I belong to backcountry hunters and anglers, is for those reasons. So I think sort of grounding that in a land ethic and thinking about those things is how I arrived at that point through hunting. But however people get there is probably a good thing.
Well said and agreed.
It's a great way to wrap it up.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Andrea, and thank you everybody else for coming. And if you can say till next time, we were hoping to have more of these this winter after hunting season, to put on a few more webinars and talk about topics that people are interested in. So if anyone's interested in anything, you can put it in the chat or contact Jill or I, and we'll try to get something going on it.
Thank you, Andrea.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was great.